This episode contains graphic descriptions of real medical scenarios faced by real medical professionals. Listener discretion is advised. From Knowledgeable Provider, this is Critical Incident. Hey, welcome back to Critical Incident from Knowledgeable Provider. I'm Jody Marks. I'm not really a morbid person. I don't usually dwell on things that I've seen or done over the years. But ever since the episode with Justin Gallion talking about death and dying, man, I've just been thinking about death. I've been thinking about all the ways I've interacted with death, all the dead people that I've seen, all the different ways I've seen people die. And maybe that is super morbid and weird, but it's just kind of interesting. I think when you work in an occupation where you frequently deal with death, you kind of develop this weird relationship with it. Like, you know it's coming for you one day, but you also feel like you're kind of fighting with it, trying to snatch people from the jaws, right? Bring people back from the brink of death or keep them from making it to the brink in the first place. And so I guess I have kind of developed this weird way of thinking about death, or this weird relationship with death. When I went to Cleveland earlier this year, I went to a play, A Christmas Carol, and had the weirdest, trippiest experience during the scene with Ebenezer Scrooge and the Ghost of Christmas Future. They had this gigantic animatronic skeleton thing that had on the black robe, the traditional thing that you think of when you think of the Grim Reaper. And I mean, this thing was massive, was as tall as the entire stage. And I just had the weirdest feeling, sensation come over me when I saw that thing lurch out on stage for the first time. I'm like, oh, it's you. Hey there. I think I was sitting there, I just cocked my head like a puppy, looking at this. And it was very surreal and weird. I'm like, oh, death, hey, we know each other. We know each other well. Just odd. So the Critical Incident segment of the podcast is where I just kind of share stories from my career. I was hoping there would be a flood of people wanting to share stories from their career, but so far that's not happened. But this will be the place to talk about all the stuff I remember about death. So yeah, here we go. Big old trigger warning on this one. I'm going to be talking about dead folks. I guess the first time I ran a call involving a death on the ambulance, I would have been 16 or 17, still in high school, still volunteering. There's a car accident on the highway right in front of where the ambulances lived in Cherokee. And I think it was a rollover. It was a man, maybe in his 60s. One of those situations where it's like, did the accident kill him or did he have a heart attack and that caused the accident? We don't know. But I remember kind of crawling under the car and there he was and he wasn't breathing. I remember the police chief was right next to me. He reached in and did what I suppose was supposed to be a precordial thump, which of course is not even done anymore. And I guess we must have worked that. I don't really remember the ride into the hospital. I just remember that one scene in my head. Really with a blunt trauma victim, if they're dead by the time you get there, you really should not work them. But I want to say we probably did. But I think that was the first full arrest, cardiac arrest kind of call that I ever went on. I've been lucky in my own life, my personal life. I've never really had to deal with people close to me dying so much. One of my classmates died of cancer when we were in maybe 5th grade, 6th grade. And I remember going to his funeral, going to the visitation. Maybe that's the first death I really saw in that kind of situation. But this call was the first time I ever ran anything involving death, like where I was supposed to do something about it. And then I remember throughout high school, we'd run a full arrest, and out there in Cherokee, it was a primarily BLS service, meaning that we'd go out to all these places and pick up these folks in cardiac arrest, and usually we didn't have anyone who could do an advanced airway, so we had nobody who could intubate. So that meant we were just trying to bag these people with an OPA in place until we could meet up with an ALS ambulance, and sometimes that was a long time. And so we would end up putting a lot of air into these people's stomachs, which meant they would vomit all over the place. And so it was always this very messy endeavor. Puke all over the place. I would go to school the next day, and I remember, without fail, whatever it was we had for lunch at school that day always reminded me of the vomit that I had to clean up the night before. I don't know that the emotional impact of those things really ever hit me much when I was a kid. I remember one night I was out in the back of the truck cleaning it up after we had run something like that, and I was like on top of the world, man. I got to run a cardiac arrest and do some CPR, and yeah, I was excited about the whole thing. And I came bebopping out of the back of the ambulance. I had this nasty towel that I've been cleaning up all the puke and blood and whatever else with, and the person's family was walking by. And I don't think they put two and two together, or I don't know if they even saw me, but I remember the weird contrast between this excitement and joy that I was feeling with this sorrow that they were having to deal with. Maybe that was the first time I really considered the emotional impact of the things that we were dealing with. I've already talked on the podcast about the whole situation with the young kids that got killed in the wreck and taking the stupid shoe back to the funeral home. That was probably the first call that ever really had a huge emotional impact on me. I struggled with that one for a while. Of course, kids always stand out, and I'm not trying to do this in any kind of chronological order. I'm just sort of saying whatever pops into my head. We ran a call this one day where this girl was on a jet ski, and I'm sorry if I've already talked about this on the podcast. I've been doing this long enough now that I sort of have trouble remembering what previous episodes were about. So if this is a repeat, I apologize. But this girl, she was 9. She was riding on a jet ski with her dad, and somehow a tree branch that was hanging over the water like hit her in the head, knocked her off in the water. And I mean, it killed her. It busted her skull. There was brain matter coming out. Like, it was not good. I have always been curious about how she got hit and not her dad. I don't know if she was sitting in front of him on the jet ski or if she was behind him and he ducked and she didn't. In the back of my mind, I've always kind of wondered if really what happened is that she got thrown off and then he ran over her. I don't know. That's neither here nor there. This is way out in Lauderdale County. We're on the ambulance and the helicopter is on the way. Also, we kind of got there about the same time, which was a blessing, of course, to have that super experienced flight crew there with me. And we worked her, of course, because it was a kid. I remember her dad was just so beside himself. He was trying to help. He was trying to do CPR, rescue breathing. And so we got there and kind of took over, but he was still right there on top of us. And the flight medic got the girl intubated really quickly. And before we could even hook up the BVM, the guy literally grabbed the ET tube and stuck it in his mouth and was trying to breathe for his daughter. And so at that point we had to really try to get him out of the way. But man, what a sad situation that was. One of the weirder things around death that we had to do there in Lauderdale County were body hauls for the funeral home. We called them body hauls. I guess we could have found a gentler name than that. So our company had this contract with one of the funeral homes in town where I think it was between midnight 6 a.m., midnight 8 a.m., something like that. In the wee hours of the morning, it was actually our job to respond to the funeral home's calls for picking up dead bodies, people that had died at home and already had an agreement with the funeral home or whatever. And that was just so egregious on so many levels. Nobody goes to paramedic school because they want to cart dead bodies around. It's not what we're there for. I never thought it was fair to us. I never thought it was fair to these poor families who are losing their loved one. And instead of 2 people in suits and a Cadillac, you get our gross tales that most of the time at that point are on the tail end of a 24-hour shift, sloppy looking uniforms and a dingy old ambulance showing up going, "Where's the body?" Not good, not fair to anyone. And the craziest part about the whole situation was at that time, for all of Lauderdale County, there were 2 ALS ambulances. There were 2 ambulances available for the entire county. I'm looking up the currently available population data for Lauderdale County. Google helpfully produced this in an interactive graph here. So let's say 2005, the population of Lauderdale County was 89,358 people. 2 ambulances for 90,000 people in this county. And this private for-profit company, North Star Paramedic Services, that still exists, would take one of those ambulances out of service in the middle of the night to go get a dead body because they made $200 or whatever. Absolutely egregious. So anyway, we would have to respond to these houses. They gave us this thing, we called it the Blue Velvet. It was a blue, plush, velvety looking cover that fit over the entire stretcher. That was the one little concession to dignity in this whole thing. We had a big rug that we could put over the patient, over our stretcher. And so we'd go to the house, we'd get the body, put it on the stretcher, cover it with the blue velvet, and then we had to drive to the funeral home. And oh, this was so spooky. You'd have to drive around back of the funeral home, open a garage door, and go into the bowels of this funeral home, which was completely dark. And obviously, this is the middle of the night. There's nobody in there, nobody alive in there. No, it was just spooky and weird and creepy. And so we'd have to take them actually all the way into where they would be embalmed. We had to put them up on the table. We couldn't leave their face covered with anything because if you leave a sheet or anything laying on their face, it'll flatten their nose out and it makes it harder for the mortician to make them look presentable for their viewing. And so we had to uncover them. We had to prop their head up on this little block, I guess, to try to keep the neck straight. I don't know what the point of that was. We had to literally put a toe tag on them, a little paper tag with a wire thing that you had to twist around the big toe that had their information on it. and we had to spray their face and hands with this moisturizing, almost like silicone spray. I guess if it dries out, it looks weird for the viewing also. And it was just the worst, most awkward, like weird thing. Like, I'm not a freaking undertaker. I don't work for the funeral home. I'm a paramedic. It's my job to prevent this. This is not what I'm trained to do. It was just the worst freaking thing ever. Ugh. There were some shenanigans that would ensue in that funeral home. Every once in a while, the second ambulance crew would manage to sneak over there and scare the other ambulance crew when they arrived with the dead body. And I heard tales of, and I'm not saying that because I did it. I really heard somebody else talking about at one point they're walking in with the body on the stretcher, and the person at the head of the stretcher like raised the body up and pulled the eyelids open so that when the person pulling the stretcher turned around, they saw the person sitting up on the stretcher. Again, another reason why you might not want to use exhausted, already crazy EMS people to go pick up these bodies. Once in a while out in Cherokee, the funeral home would ask us, just as a courtesy, I guess, to transport a dead body from a scene to their place. But that was not something we ever did routinely. It was just like if they didn't have anybody available or whatever, we'd do it just as a favor to them, I suppose. Sometimes we'd have to go to people who had been dead for a long time. And when a body's decomposing, like, you can smell it. You can smell it from outside the house, down the road. Sometimes I can understand why sometimes people get found because somebody smells them and calls law enforcement to come check on them. And it's a terrible smell. It is absolutely awful. I mean, if you've ever smelled a dead animal, it's like that, but multiply it times 1,000. Oh, it's awful. And we would have to go into these places and still go through the whole rigmarole of calling the doctor and getting an order to say that this person is dead. And really, technically, you're supposed to put a cardiac monitor on everybody before you do that. You're supposed to get confirmation that their heart is not beating. But there were some times that, you'd walk in and this person was just all black and bloated and swollen and unrecognizable. And we'd just call and say, look, I promise, Scout's honor, this person is dead. There is no doubt this person is dead. I am not going in this nasty old mess to hook up a cardiac monitor to this person. You can forget it. And that smell just stays with you. Bah. Maybe the grossest death thing I was ever involved in. There was this guy at this kind of long-term, cheap, extended stay motel place that looked like something out of the 60s, horror movie that used to be over off Governor's Drive. And maybe part of it's still there. I'm not sure. But we went down there one time. This guy died, and it was evident that he had a GI bleed and died because of that. When I tell you there was shit everywhere, there was shit everywhere. It was like pooled on the floor. It was all over the walls. It was everywhere in this little apartment. Like, he had to have just run around out of his mind right before he died, like smearing feces and bloody feces at that, which is a whole different level of stank on everything. It was the most ungodly thing. And he's laying there in the middle of this puddle of poo. And this was not a decomposition situation. He hadn't been there that long, but he was obviously dead. We weren't going to work him. And so we had to go in there and hook up the monitor and get a strip in this middle of this mess. I remember we put down a sheet so we could kind of walk through the disgustingness to get to him. And this was the only time I ever saw anybody not be able to stay in a situation. My partner just started gagging. We were trying to do our thing and he's going, bleh, bleh. And finally I was like, I can do this, man. I think it was actually his turn to do patient care. And he's like, no, I got it. Bleh, bleh. And finally I just said, really, I can do this. Like, it's cool. Just go on out. I'll take care of it. That's the only time I ever saw anybody get sick to the point where they had to leave something. And I don't know how I didn't, but I've never been susceptible to that for whatever reason. One night we had this really bad accident out on the interstate, and we referred to this is not politically correct, okay? We referred to this as the Night of the Undead Mexicans. So it was this big multi-car wreck, several ambulances responding to the scene, like huge deal. And so I was either the third or fourth ambulance in. So by the time we arrived, we had heard multiple times on the radio that we had 2 dead people, and then there were these other patients that we had to deal with. So my partner and I arrived, we get our crap out of the truck, and we walked by the vehicle that had the 2 dead people in it. And we didn't stop to check. Everybody else had said they were dead, and they sure looked dead. They were just in the front seat of this car, just, crushed, obviously. And so we looked and kind of, oh, that's terrible, and then walked on by and went on to help with the still alive patients. And it ended up that the other ambulances and a helicopter transported all the patients. So my ambulance, we did not have to transport anybody. So we helped out, did whatever we did, and we go back to the ambulance. We're cleaning up. We're in the process of leaving. and one of the police officers comes over and goes, "Hey, one of these other guys is still breathing." We're like, "What?" And because at this point it's been, I mean, who knows? It's been an hour probably since this happened. And what happened was when they went to remove the bodies from the car, when they pulled the dashboard off of one of these people, they started breathing again. Or at least I guess it became evident that they were breathing. But it's like, dear God, we've wasted so much time. We all missed the fact that this person was still alive. I mean, this is an absolute nightmare. And so then we had to jump into action and do the whole thing. And I guess we must have transported the guy to the hospital. And I guess he must have died later. But man, talk about embarrassing. Talk about a failure of everyone to recognize that person was still alive. Jeez. That was very much on my mind. Another time when I worked this rollover accident, this person had been partially thrown out of the vehicle. It's a big white SUV, like maybe a Yukon or something like that. And he's kind of thrown halfway out of the window and the car's laying on top of him. So all I can see is half of his body. And he's dead, no pulse, not breathing. I mean, dead. And I remember the volunteer firefighters showed up and offered to raise the car off of him. And I said, no, it's okay. You don't have to worry about it. He's dead. But of course, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, I mean, I hope he's dead. He's not breathing. I can't feel a pulse. Like, he's apparently dead. But just because of that experience, I sat there at the scene and waited on law enforcement to get there and the investigation to happen and blah, blah, blah. And I waited until it got to the point where they allowed the vehicle to be raised up off of him just to make sure, because I definitely didn't want to have that situation happen again. In retrospect, I don't know why I didn't just say, yeah, let's lift the car off of him. But at that point, I would have been kind of working it, and I would have felt like I had to continue working it and transport, even though you're not supposed to do that. One of those gray area sort of ethical dilemma situations. Going back to the whole stank thing, one time out there in that same area, we went to this hotel, and I don't think we knew what we were being called for. We were just requested by law enforcement. And so we get there, and these sheriff's deputies are coming out of this hotel room, running around with their gas masks on. And we're like, oh, this must be horrible. Somebody has died in there and decomposing. And so we go in there expecting a dead person, and it did smell awful. I'll grant you that. But this person was very much alive. He's sitting there in the squalor of this horrible, no-tell, motel, long-term stay hotel place. Just happy as he can be. I remember I walked in the door expecting a dead body, and it was like, hey, how you doing? And I guess we ended up transporting him to the hospital. Not dead, just extremely nasty. One time I was working as a fill-in supervisor at the ambulance service, and so I'm out in a pickup truck by myself, supervisor vehicle. I'm sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store here in town eating lunch, minding my own business, and somebody comes up to the truck and like knocks on the window or whatever, gets my attention. And they say, hey, we're worried about our friend that lives over here. He didn't show up to work today and nobody can get in touch with him, and we need to check on him. So we go over to this little apartment building. I'm knocking on the door. Nobody's answering. Can't see inside. Everything's locked up. So I call for law enforcement to come. The police officer makes entry into the apartment. We go in snooping around, and sure enough, we find this guy. He's dead in his bed. Very peaceful. He just looked like he was laying there sleeping, but he had in fact died. And it was extremely busy in the county at that moment. Like, everybody was off on calls, and I didn't want to tie up an ambulance to come just verify that this person was dead. And so I get on the radio and I'm like, hey, I need a cardiac monitor. I need somebody to bring me a monitor. I don't even need an ambulance. Just somebody bring me a monitor so I can run the strip, so I can call for orders and do a death in the field, and we don't have to tie up an ambulance for this. And I must not have said it that explicitly on the radio. I was trying to be delicate and just say, hey, I don't need anything but a monitor. I guess I never said ... because the patient is dead. And so they ended up just sending an ambulance. So the crew shows up. And again, I was just sort of assuming that they knew what was going on. So we all go bebopping in there. We walk inside, and I kneel down beside the bed, and I'm starting to hook the electrodes up to run a strip on this guy. And one of the medics goes, oh, is he having chest pain or something? And I looked up at her and I said, are you joking? I said, he's dead. That made me question someone's assessment skills. Again, back to kids, you always remember being involved with bad situations with kids. The only infant I ever had to code on the ambulance was over in Florence, and it was right at the end of the shift. We were just about to get off, and we get a call to this apartment complex right over by the hospital by ECM in Florence. And we get there, and this woman runs out and literally throws her baby at me. And it was dead. It had been dead. It was actually, there was some rigor, they ended up saying later at the hospital. But obviously, I mean, I'm not, in that situation, you throw me a dead baby, I'm going to take the baby and go to the hospital with it. I'm not leaving it here. We're going to do everything we possibly can. And we were so close to the hospital that really we just did CPR and ventilated the child all the way to the hospital, and they ended up saying, "Oh, we can't get it intubated because of the jaws and rigor." So really, the technical right thing to do would have been not to code the baby, but we certainly were not going to do that. One time I had to run I believe he was 12-year-old kid that hung himself. This was a situation where for whatever reason, they didn't have accurate information. We did not realize what we were walking into, because I remember we came in unprepared and we kind of strolled back into the room, and I wasn't the first person there, but somebody else walked back in there and found this kid hanging in the closet and was like, shit, this is a full arrest. We need all the stuff. And I remember turning around and running back through the house, and the kid's dad was just dazed. He was standing in the middle of the living room, like just kind of orbiting around, just completely out of it, dazed. Because I remember having to go, move, get out of the way. I had to run out to the truck and get all the equipment, and it was my turn to drive. And like overall, I would rather be doing patient care. I love driving the truck. It's nice to just kind of take a mental break and just drive. But overall, especially on a bad call, it made me feel like I wasn't doing anything if I was just driving the truck. So all in all, I would have preferred to have been doing patient care. But as it was, I just had to sort of assist. There were other medics there, and my partner did a fantastic job. He got this kid intubated, even though obviously it was a crushed trachea kind of situation. He'd been hung. The doctor even commented on how amazing it was that my partner was able to intubate this kid. But I remember driving to the hospital, and I was kind of freaking out, I guess, because I remember I was like yelling at cars, get out of the way, get out of the way. And I had the radio cranked up really loud, because I used to like to do that on cardiac arrest calls. And I remember the song. I think Justin mentioned on the podcast that he would never forget this one particular song. And that's the same deal with this, the song that was on the radio while that was going on. Every time I hear it, that's exactly what I go back to, is that call. And the child died, and it was very sad. I found his obituary in my little memory box the other day. I didn't even remember that I had kept it, but there it was. And it was never on the news. I never heard anything about it. There was no like, we're starting this foundation to help prevent suicide. Like, never heard a word about it ever. It's just like, he's just gone. And obviously, I'm sure his family remembers him, but it's just weird how you'd think something like that would be a seismic event, but it's just not in the grand scheme of things. Very, very sad. Another time when I had to drive on a full arrest, this was toward the end of my career. This was when I was kind of getting to the point where it was harder for me to not show emotion about things. We go to this place. It's off of University Drive. It was a house way back off in the woods. I wouldn't have even known it was back there. This very, very old couple, and the woman died at home, went into cardiac arrest at home. And so we worked her. We transported her to the hospital, and the husband was sitting up front with me. And of course, he's bawling, and I just couldn't hold it together. I just started crying also. I remember we're coming out of this driveway, and the driveway comes right out onto University Drive, which is like a really busy road. And so I remember the police had traffic stopped for us. So there's this huge line of cars sitting there waiting on me to turn out. And I, of course, turned my head to look in their direction. And I'm like, all these people are seeing me with tears streaming down my face, like obviously crying, driving this ambulance. So I hope that made an impression on them. I hope all those people who saw that will forever think, oh, I really need to get out of the way for this ambulance. Something important might be going on. Moving into the ICU, the pediatric ICU as a nurse, that was the first time that I really had to have kind of longer interactions with people around death and after death. Other than the situation I talked about where we had to take people to the funeral home, mostly in EMS, you don't deal with people after they're dead. You show up and you either work on them because they're in cardiac arrest and they have not technically died yet, or you show up and they're already dead and you're not doing anything and you leave. You very rarely actually have to deal with anybody's dead body after it has died. But that's what you have to do as a nurse when somebody dies in the hospital. You have to do whatever needs to be done to make the patient presentable for their family to come and say their last goodbyes and spend time and whatever it is they want to do. Because it's kind of messy when someone dies, the bowels release, and then whatever was going on with them in the first place, if they have blood all over them or other body fluids, or if they have lines and tubes and whatnot, it can be a mess. And so we try our best to clean the person up so that when their family comes to see them, they don't look horrible or smell horrible or whatever. And that was kind of horrifying to me, having to wrap my mind around doing all that. We had these things that we would do in PICU called bereavement boxes, where we would kind of do a collection of things to give to the family. We would do like handprints and footprints, take a lock of hair and put it in this little thing. And it was kind of just a nice, memento thing of just the last chance that they would have to have anything related to their child. And I came to see that as a really good thing because it's just nice. I mean, it's something comforting and nice you can do for a family. But having to wrap my mind around actually doing all that stuff was a bit of a mental leap for me. I was like, we have to do what? Are you kidding me? And then we would have to take the body eventually to the morgue, which I think on day shift, some transporter comes to do that. But on night shift, it was just us. We had to do it ourselves. And so the hospital had this big giant, I guess you call it a stretcher. It was more like a box on wheels, but you'd move the patient into it and it had this big green cover over it. So if anybody didn't know what it was, you wouldn't realize that there was a body in there. But we'd have to put them in that thing and then roll them all the way through the hospital. And I don't know what it is about morgues if they have to be in scary places, but the morgue at Huntsville Hospital is down. Like you have to walk through the bowels of the hospital and through all these places that you would never see otherwise. And we'd have to actually roll them into it's just a big freezer, I guess, just a big cooler with shelves in it for bodies. And you'd have to like add your body to I don't want to say pile. You'd have to add your former patient now body into the collection of other bodies. Very weird, very weird. Not something you really want to do. I've seen violent deaths. You go to situations where people have died from traumatic injuries. They've been shot or stabbed or whatever. I ran this old guy that's tractor flipped over on him and crushed him. A lot of deaths from car accidents. One night I was driving out on the interstate very late and I ran up on this horrible accident. It was right where 65 and 565 come together. And it was just awful. I think it was two cars and they were absolutely just demolished and nobody was there. No emergency vehicles. Like this had just happened, I guess. And so I stop and I get out with my little responder bag that I used to carry at the time. And I went around checking everybody and everybody was dead. Every single person was dead. There must have been at least 3, 4. I don't know. I don't remember how many people, but there were like bodies laying around and bodies still in the car. There were bodies everywhere. And it seemed like some of them were probably kids. They were smaller. But so I went around and checked everyone and they're all dead. Dead. And so I just kind of stood there with my little bag until the fire truck pulled up and I went and met the crew and I said, hey, I checked on everybody. I think they're all dead. I don't think there's really anything to do. And I got back in my car and I drove on and I thought, I'm surely going to see that on the news. We're going to hear the story of what happened. Not a word. Never heard anything. It was not on the news. Never heard anybody talk about to this day, I wonder if I just dreamed the whole thing. I didn't. It was very real. I still remember it when I passed that spot on the road, but man, just surreal, just very surreal encountered with death there. And a lot of it all in one place. I ran a suicide one time where this lady shot herself in the head in her bed. She left a note for her family out in the kitchen, something to the effect of like, don't go in the bedroom, just call 911. That was a very creepy scene. I ran a call where this was an elderly couple. This man just blew his wife away, just blasted her with a shotgun. She was laying in bed. He shot her in the chest with a shotgun, which you kind of think about younger people doing crazy things like that. You don't really think about that happening to older people. Again, very odd, very weird scene, weird vibe there. One of the last, maybe the last death in the field call I ran as a paramedic, these young kids, 18, 19, were playing video games, and evidently one of them was kind of like messing around with the gun and accidentally shot himself in the head. And we got there pretty quickly, and I mean, he's got a hole in his head. There's like brain matter, oozing out of it. But we put him on like a monitor and there's still some electrical activity in the heart. And we all kind of look at each other like, no, absolutely not. This kid is definitely dead. His heart just hasn't caught up with it yet. And so there's this weird waiting period where we're kind of waiting for that electrical activity to all die down. So we get asystole on the monitor and very, very odd feeling just sort of sitting there waiting on somebody to die while you're watching their brain ooze out. Not ideal. And I developed this way of thinking that I needed to say something to the people around because it's technically the doctor that I'm speaking to who's declaring the person dead. And the coroner's coming to get them and the funeral homes. Like I'm not like the ultimate authority on any of this stuff, but I am the person at the time who's making the decision about we're going to try to do something versus we're not. And so you can just do your job and get in the truck and leave and not say anything to anyone. But I feel like the right thing to do, the extra mile thing to do, is to make contact with the family and go, hey, this is why we're not doing anything. It's been too long, or there's just obviously nothing we can do, or whatever the situation is. And so I did develop this routine of trying to explain to the family members that we're not doing anything and they have died and that whole rigmarole, which is hard to do. It's hard to do. It's hard to know what to say. Very uncomfortable, just an uncomfortable situation to be in. And sometimes people get mad. One time back in volunteer days, we were coding this lady in her house, and I think it was her son, was just irate. He's running around in circles, literally running around us, shouting at us. Because I remember him saying, if that was your fucking mother, you'd be doing more or whatever. And we were working her. We were doing CPR. We're doing our thing, but I guess he wanted to see more freaking out like he was or something. I mean, I felt threatened. I felt like I was about to get whacked in the back of the head or something. This guy was irate. I remember I looked up at the police officer and said, will you please, deal with this? Will you get him out of here? And, you can't blame somebody for being upset in that situation, but don't take it out on me. I'm here trying to help, Justin and I talked a little bit about these situations where you have somebody that's been sick for years, totally wasted away. I remember doing CPR on literal skeletons, like you'd think you would see in the places in Somalia where they make those commercials where nobody has anything to eat and they are all starving. That's what they look like, but still the family wants you to do everything you can and there's no advance directive. And it just feels like the ultimate last little shred of dignity that somebody had is now gone because we're having to do all this stupid stuff for somebody who obviously should be dead. And sometimes you have the opposite situation where you think you ought to do something, but the family doesn't want it. One time in Cherokee, I responded to a cardiac arrest and we got there and it was a fairly recent thing. The guy had coded fairly recently, which was not always the case out in Cherokee. It took us a long time to get there usually, but this happened pretty close to town. So we got there in a reasonable amount of time and we're starting to do our thing and get everything in place. And this wife just stopped us. She was like, no, I don't want you to do anything. She said, I don't want him on no machines. And we kind of all looked at each other like, but this is pretty recent. We're thinking we might actually have a chance of doing some good here. And, of course we respected her wishes. And I mean, chances are the guy was not coming back, but still it felt weird to just have to stop when we all felt like we should continue. But I mean, all you can do is respect people's wishes around you and just hope it's the right decision. It was always super frustrating getting called to people who were hospice patients, as in you're on hospice because you have a terminal diagnosis and we expect you to die. And when you're on hospice, generally that means you don't call 911, you don't go to the hospital, like the person dies at home and then they take care of it, they deal with it. But inevitably, a lot of times when somebody does die at home, the family will freak out and call 911. And so then you find yourself in the situation where you're like, this is a hospice patient. We have an advance directive, but family members now yelling at us to do something. And again, you just have to go with what the people around you are saying. And we would err on the side of working them. But the whole time you just feel terrible. We know this is not what this person wants. We know that this is not the right thing to do. But I mean, hell, you only get one chance to make that decision. And in the moment, I guess you tend to err on the side of doing something versus not. But if the family's yelling at you to do something, you're going to do something. It's a weird situation. Some more gross memories are coming back. One time we went to this guy that had been dead for a while and we go in the house and the flies, I mean, I don't know how to describe this cloud of flies, but I mean, it literally was a cloud, like a swarm of blackness that's all flies. And, I'm trying to walk through this house and there are flies just popping me, just ramming themselves against me, hitting me. Oh, it was so weird. It's just this loud, all the flies buzzing around. And it was so gross. And the guy was laying on the bed face down. And I remember I thought it'd be a good idea to try to find his ID because we didn't know who he was. And it was in his billfold was in his back pocket. And I used my scissors and actually cut his wallet out of his pocket and got his stuff out of there. Oh, those flies. Oh, I'll never forget those flies. Ugh. That was in North Star days early in my medic career. But if that had been further along in my career, I would have taken one look inside there and went, yeah, he's dead. That's it. Oh, it was disgusting. One time we got called way out in the middle of nowhere. It was a cabin. I mean, just picture a small cabin in the woods. Maybe it had electricity, maybe it didn't. We go out there for a person who had died, and this guy had shot himself with a shotgun, blew his head off while he was sitting in his recliner. And I remember the door to the place was locked. It was a storm door, like a screen door, so we could see in, and we could see the headless body sitting there. I remember you could see some of his teeth still kind of laying on top of his shoulders. I guess maybe it was his mandible or something, but it was very weird just seeing a headless body with a big bloody lump where the head should be and some teeth. And that was definitely one where we were like, okay, dead. No further assessment needed. We're out. Oh, another thing I forgot I was going to talk about, gross anatomy. I had the opportunity to take gross anatomy, as in you go to a lab and dissect a dead human being. And maybe that's the least favorite encounter with death I've ever had. Man, that was awful. That was absolutely awful. It's at UAB, it's down in the basement, and it's this very medical labby looking room with all these metal tables, all these bodies laying on them. In my head, there's probably 20 different bodies laid out. It was a big room, lots of tables, lots of bodies, and you just spend your entire waking hours down there with this body, cutting around on it and trying to learn the different parts. And it was very helpful. You can look at a drawing in the anatomy book of where everything is and where everything's supposed to be, but that's not the same as actually seeing it in situ or inside an actual body. So I see why it's important to really actually know where a spleen is and what it feels like and what it looks like. And when I'm assessing patients now, it is kind of helpful to just I really know what's in there. I've seen what's in there. I know where the stuff kind of is and what it kind of looks like and what it feels like. And it is good to have that knowledge when you're assessing alive people. But man, what a horrible experience. I would never want to do that again. The smell of whatever preservative they use, I mean, it just permeated your skin, your nose. You could smell it and taste it all the time. This was in 2004, 21 years ago. And just the other day, somebody gave me a bunch of pedophores, little cake things. And I swear those things tasted exactly like that flippin' formaldehyde preservative. It tasted just like it. I put one in my mouth and I was immediately back in the cadaver lab. And it just, oh my God, I couldn't do it. I couldn't eat these little cakes. I just had to stay away. I had to run away from them because I did not want to think about that. Absolutely horrible. Ugh. And I was not good at dissecting, by the way. If I ever had any aspirations of being a surgeon, everything I tried to dissect around, I ended up just obliterating it. I finally just gave up and I was just the person who stood there with the textbook while people who, for whatever reason, were very good at that did it. Not something I'd ever want to do again. Maybe my least favorite memory having anything to do with death was flipping gross anatomy. Oh my God. Man, what a weird thing to talk about. It's very weird to kind of say all this out loud. I've always had these thoughts running around in my head, but I don't know that I've ever talked to anybody about most of this stuff. So it's kind of weird to hear this all come out. What's even weirder is knowing that I've been to so many more places where people have died and things that I don't even remember, that I forgot. It's weird that you could forget being involved in something like that, but I mean, who knows how many cardiac arrests I've worked and how many deaths in the field I've done, which is kind of a blessing. I don't want to think about all this stuff all the time. I don't want to remember these things, but it's just weird that you can get to a point where that sort of thing is routine. My dad had a friend that was a Green Beret, I think, Special Forces, something in that neighborhood. He was a medic in the military, and he served in, I think, the first Gulf War. I was a young kid, but I remember him coming back, and then over the years, I remember every once in a while he would tell a story. He would bust out some awful story of something that he did, and it was just amazing thinking that he had to carry those images all around with him all the time, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of veterans. And I would never compare the experience of being a civilian paramedic to being a combat medic. I'm sure it's a whole different thing. But maybe there is some degree of just carrying that around with you. You know, you carry those images, you carry those memories. Okay, I guess that's all I wanted to say. Nothing else is coming to mind at the moment. Thanks for listening. Hopefully this was not too disturbing or didn't make me sound too bad. Special thanks to our Patreon supporters. I hope you have a great week, and I will talk to you later. I would love to share your critical incident on the podcast. If you have a story you want to tell, send it to me by email at thekppod@gmail.com. That's thekppod@gmail.com. You can send it in writing and I'll read the story. You can make a high-quality recording of yourself telling the story and I'll play that. Or I can interview you about it, either remotely or in person. Thank you for listening, and as always, stay safe, take care of yourself, and take care of your patients in that order.